A multitude of words is no proof of a prudent mind. Good evening and welcome. This is Face the Nation. Our topic of discussion today is the issues in the Red Sea and Sri Lanka's interest to fight someone else's war. To discuss all this and more, we've invited four guests to our studios this evening. Joining us this evening on the show are Rear Admiral Y.N. Jayaratna, Kusum Vijaytilaka, Foreign Policy Analyst, Nilantan Niruntan, Defence and Policy Analyst, as well as Dr. Dan Malika Gunasekara, Maritime Law Expert. To pose questions from our panelists this evening, on to my immediate right is Niresh Aliathambi, Consultant English News Director at Newsfirst. You too can join in as far as the conversation is concerned. Send in your messages via WhatsApp, 076 656 5353. The number once again, 076 656 5353. The topic again, issues in the Red Sea and Sri Lanka's interest to fight someone else's war. So let's get the ball rolling today with retired Rear Admiral Y.N. Jayaratna for his thoughts on our topic tonight. Your time starts now.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here. At the beginning, I must say, will Red Sea be our Waterloo? It's a little scary topic, I would say, but it will not be. See, that's an issue, and the head of state of this island nation has made a comment that we are going to commit ourselves in safeguarding the sea lane of communication. And this particular sea area that is south of Red Sea, Bab el Mandeb Strait, is a crucial part in our sea lane of communication. So to be there, yes, obviously the Navy will be the choice, and Sri Lanka Navy is having the capacity. So having capacity in the sense, it is the OPVs, Offshore Patrol Vessel Class, OPV class vessels. So the Navy is equipped with that, and that is what the navies are there for, to meet national interest. If we take back for about 15 years back, when the separatist terrorism was taking place, decision was taken to go after the center of gravity of the enemy, that is their floating armories, very, very far away distances, almost on the south of equator, almost near to the Australian EZ. So we sent a task force. So then command of the Navy, Admiral Vasantha Karannagoda, made a decision, and he chose one of the brilliant task force commanders, Commodore Travis Sinaya, and a fleet of ships that went, and we hunted down. So for national interest, government decided to use the Navy, and the Navy did that. Navy went after it and met it. So likewise, the naval assets are therefore, that is for meet the national interest. So similarly, in a very recent contemporary history, when the drug running, the drug coming from Iranian dows through the Arabian Sea, across the Maldivian archipelago, it is the Navy who decided to go after them in the high seas. And one by one, they were taken out. So for national interest. And
Admiral, Rear Admiral, if I may interject and pose a question to you very quickly. You say national interest should be the core as far as the security forces of the country is concerned, and we totally understand. You gave some examples for it as well. But what is the national interest to fight someone else's war in the Red Sea?
Well, let me put it this way. We are not going to fight someone else's war. We are going to meet international obligation of safeguarding sea lane of communication. Now, this is something the government has to very carefully manipulate and exercise their wordings. Because if we portray that we are going to fight someone else's war, it's going to be a very disadvantage for us. But if we operate on the pretext of safeguarding sea lane of communication, that demonstrates our commitment as a regional navy with some capacity to contribute to coalition patrols.
So this is the first time ever, if Sri Lanka deploys an OPV, which is called an offshore patrolling class vessel, this would be the first time that Sri Lanka would engage in a collision patrolling task in any of the seas that we're talking about in the world?
Yes.
This is the first time.
Yeah, it is the first operational deployment
Right.
under coalition.
Very quickly, Rear Admiral, do we have the technology to do this?
Well, technology-wise, there's a lacuna that has to be invested, and the government had to spend for it. So
Do we have the money?
Yes, that is my concern. Although the head of state is committed for that, do the government is ready to spend that amount of money? Because there will be operational cost, there will be maintenance cost.
How much of a cost are we talking about? Because initially we got the feeling that it was approximately around 251 million Sri Lankan rupees for 6 weeks. Is that figure correct?
Well, these OPV class vessels generally spend diesel alone, the cost of diesel alone come to about 50 to 60 million Sri Lankan rupees for a 1 month petrol at sea, high sea petrol. So this is a huge cost. So the government has to be ready for it. I mean, that is why the navies cannot be built overnight. It has to be maintained. So we have the vessels, but do we have the necessary technology? So weaponry wise, there's somewhat weaponry available, but there's a lot more to be done before we send the ships, because we need certain new equipment to replace our obsolete equipment before we send him to this operational area. I won't say it is a combat zone, because we surely will not be operating in the high intensity combat zone. We will be operating in periphery, but even in periphery, the threat assessment point out the enemy is using cruise missiles and ballistic missiles.
Is there a threat of Sri Lankan Navy personnel losing their lives?
No, see, on board a ship, ships are inherently trained to handle contingencies, emergencies, damage control. So this is a part of the job. So whether people will lose their life, I don't know.
Do we need this at this moment of time?
Well, it is the head of state has committed for that, and the navies are there for it. So it's a matter of commitment by the government to take that talk a little bit forward.
Right. Thank you very much, Rear Admiral Y.N. Jayaratna. We have more questions for you, Rear Admiral, but we'll get back to all those momentarily as we go along as far as the show is concerned. We now move our attention towards Kusum Vijayatilaka, foreign policy analyst. What are your thoughts, Kusum?
Thanks, Shamir, and thank you everyone for having me here. A pleasure to be a part of the panel. I just want to use the opening statement to sort of impress upon the audience something I think is quite striking about the situation we find ourselves in. As my colleague just said, the Admiral just said that this is the theatre. It's a combat theatre. Maybe we are on the periphery of the combat zone. But we know, for example, that the United States has assembled a multinational, multi-nation alliance, a coalition. I think the operation is called Prosperity Guardian. And so this operation comes in the midst of the Houthi rebels' attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea. I want, obviously, to impress upon everybody in the audience that commercial shipping is extremely important for the global economy. It's important for things like inflation, and it's obviously a crucial part of the world economy. Now, having said that, in such a situation when there's money on the line, Western nations have come together and had a very clear option of pushing back against this. Now, I want to just take a step away from that and just take a look at what is driving the conflict in the Red Sea right now. The Houthi rebels have said that they were initially trying to target ships going into Israel, and they've been very clear. Now, that may or may not be accurate. I'll leave it to the other colleagues. But the fact of the matter is that this is part of the Gazan war, part of the Israeli aggression in Gaza. Now, in such a situation in Gaza, as of today, we have something like 30,000 people dead from strikes in Gaza, from Israeli strikes. Out of that 30,000, about 27,000 are civilians. From that 27,000 civilians, there's 12,000 children that's estimated. So we're talking about a situation in the Red Sea where we have dollars, economies, and funds at stake. But when it comes to the lives of people in the Gaza Strip, I don't see any such coalition, any such Western pressure certainly. The Sri Lankan government, at the very least, amongst with the majority of other governments, we've called for a ceasefire. But on the other side, we still haven't seen, other than a brief period of 7 days in late December, hostilities have only worsened. The deaths are only increasing. The intensity is still the same. So I just want people to understand that it's a very striking fact that we have that to protect commercial interests, the United States and Western countries are dragging in ships from as far as the Indian Ocean from Sri Lanka. Okay. But to protect lives, there is significantly less urgency. And we've seen the votes in the United Nations and the Security Council, and we know who is voting for a ceasefire, and we can see who is voting against a ceasefire. In this situation, I think it's important that we bring it back to Sri Lanka, in a situation where we have a head of state who's decided that this is a necessity for Sri Lanka. But is he using that same urgency to meet the challenges of the people in the Sri Lankan economy? If you're spending something like 250 million rupees every 6 weeks, if it's, you know, I assume the diesel we're paying for in dollars, so then we have to find foreign exchange. It's not just a matter of rupees. And I think it's reflective of the priorities that this government, maybe, and we will come to the strategic imperatives involved and the cost versus benefits of this. But I think it's important at the outset to show that this is not necessarily what the Sri Lankan people are calling for. I haven't seen any evidence that our ship is going to affect any inflation issue in the world either. I don't know how much capabilities we have or what it adds to it. But let's just see that these decisions have been taken with certain imperatives in mind. Where the people's imperatives come in that list of priorities, I think is what's up for debate. So with that, I'll end my
are you trying to say, Kusum, that this is not a prudent decision made by the president at this point of time?
I would say the information available is thin on the ground. For example, we know how the world works, right? We know what Sri Lanka's position is in the world. So did we have a choice in this? Are we joining Operation Prosperity Guardian? If we didn't have a choice, are we getting anything in return? And do we have any, I wouldn't even mind if Secretary of State Blinken or President Biden were to mention to the world's media, just passing, X, Y, and Z countries are giving us ships, and mention Sri Lanka, just put our name out in the media if this is in a situation where we have to do this. And remember that it also gives a perspective, right? Because the entire world is calling for a ceasefire. The Houthi rebels are one of the only, along with Hezbollah, are one of the only parties in the globe that are actually taking direct military action against some aspect of the Israeli state and the Israeli economy. Okay, so in a situation like that, the perception is that Sri Lanka has to play its part, that we have to go along with our Western allies. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think we need our Western allies. We know where we are in the Indian Ocean. So I think it presents an interesting dynamic, and I think we need more information. I can't say prudent or not, but I have to ask if this is a priority, and I have to ask if the money is there. And if the money is there for this, shouldn't there be money for other things? I think it's a natural question that anybody will ask.
Like an election.
Or just social welfare, the health sector, absolutely anything. Take your pick.
Thanks a lot, Kusum Vijaytilaka, foreign policy analyst. We now move our attention towards Nilandan Niruthan, defense and policy analyst.
So under general circumstances, I am in favor of Sri Lanka being a part of a regional or a global security setup, because I think it's good for things like sharing of expertise, sharing of lessons learned, synergizing ourselves into a regional or a global security framework. And all of these are important. As the Rear Admiral pointed out, navies are not built overnight, and this is how you build navies. The problem, however, comes from what seems to be, as has already been pointed out, the lack of clarity. We were first told that it was going to cost a certain amount of money. We are now being told by the Defense Ministry that there will be no additional costs involved. But as we just heard, this is something that we need to do with the intent of investing in this country's navy and with the intent of investing in some kind of development, because if that is not the ulterior motive here, then it's quite pointless for us to do this. And you raised a very important point about whether we are fighting someone else's war. Now, obviously, we need to discuss this other person's position, because when you look at Washington's position regarding how one deals with the Houthi rebels, it's just been a flip-flop. Let's just look at the last 3 presidential elections, right? So when Donald Trump came to power, he was heavily in favor of America supporting the Saudi-led coalition against the Houthi rebels. And he also lobbied hard to get them labeled as an FTO, a foreign terrorist organization. And he even used his special powers to veto attempts by the US Senate to remove all support from the Saudi-led coalition. You then have Joe Biden becoming president, and one of the first foreign policy decisions that he makes is to revoke the FTO terrorist status of the Houthi rebels. It's to completely withdraw Washington's support from the Saudi-led coalition. So it's the diametric opposite. And if we look at Barack Obama, his second term before that, that was different from these two, where he was in support of Washington allying with the Saudi coalition, but he was not in support of getting the Houthi rebels FTO status. So in the last 3 presidential terms of Washington, we have seen a complete change, a flip-flop of what America's position is, and it's election year now. So are we committing to some kind of regional and global strategy that's going to be abandoned by Washington in a short while? These are the things that we need to think about, the geopolitical repercussions, the economic repercussions. Are we actually putting the investment in time and research that's necessary to understand this? That would be my basic concern at the moment. If I could just add one small thing. So the idea of we are in an economic crisis right now, therefore we cannot participate in this. We are not alone in this conundrum. If you look at a country like Pakistan, our neighbor, which to a certain extent is in just as bad, if not worse, economic straits than us, they are currently experiencing the same debate, where they do want to deploy vessels into the Arabian Sea and perhaps even into the Red Sea. But they are, number one, worried that it will be taken as an anti-Palestinian gesture. And number two, they are simply worried about whether this would be feasible for them on a financial basis. So those are my 3 basic starting observations.
So Nilandan, we have 197 countries in the world.
Yeah.
We have 100 countries with Navy.
Yeah.
And why Sri Lanka? And we have only 20 countries who've already told, based on what the Pentagon has said,
Yes.
That have engaged in this war against the Houthi rebels in the Red Sea. Why little Sri Lanka should be involved in this fight?
So, I mean, that's a very valid question. In fact, if I could expand on what you just said, out of the 20 countries, there are only about 10 of them or 15 of them, number one, who are publicly named. And number two, many of the countries on that list are not sending ships. Australia is just sending officers. Canada is just sending officers. Norway and Denmark are just sending officers. And yet they're all on that list. So even on that list of navies who are under Operation Prosperity Guardian, there are only a handful: Bahrain, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. These are the countries who have actually come forward. Of course, there are the 3 permanent members of the Security Council, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, that are there actively doing stuff. But even in that list, many close allies like Australia and Canada are not even sending vessels. So it is a valid question. It's just that under general circumstances, these things are good for a small country like us to synergize into a larger network. But your question about whether this has to be the issue where that happens, I think that's a valid one.
So you mean to say we are shooting ourselves in the foot?
We certainly could. Currently, there's contradicting information from the government. We don't seem to have any idea over how long we intend to stay there. Is the warship that the current warship that we're sending now is obviously just a frigate class for patrolling and things like that. Are the future ones we are sending going to be of the frigate class? See, the thing is, with a generic term like warship that countries currently use, a warship can be anything. It could be a frigate, it could be a corvette, it could be a destroyer. Let's think of it this way. An aircraft carrier that's as big as a small city with thousands of crew members is also a warship. and a submarine with about 15 to 20 crew members is also a warship. So even with these 20 countries, those who say they will send quote-unquote warships to the region, there's very little clarity over what exactly they intend to send over the long term.
Right. Thank you very much, Nilandan Nirudhan, a defense and policy analyst. We now move our attention towards Dr. Dan Malika Gunasekara, maritime law expert.
Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me. And to be back here is again a pleasure for me, Shamir and Niresh. To start with, I would like to state that referring to today's topic, will the Red Sea issue be our Waterloo? In terms of geopolitics, I would not agree with it. But when it comes to economy, especially concerning commercial maritime, there is a possibility that it may become a Waterloo. Why I say this as a legal person, let me explain to you. Because Sri Lanka is a member state of the United Nations, and we have subscribed the United Nations Charter. And under the United Nations Charter, there are specific provisions on threat or use of force against states and other interests of states. Now, this is a situation where the Houthis, being a de facto government, are using threat or use of force against commercial shipping in this respect, where commercial shipping have interests of a lot of countries that use a ship to carry their cargo. And Sri Lanka, being an export-import sensitive country, that we export things, we import things, and there is a lot of interest in the vessels that are passing through this area of the Red Sea, especially with a 17 nautical mile breadth that we are talking about, where the Yemenis militia is using the force or threat of use of force. And as a country that has to have some kind of international obligation on international law, like my friend Rear Admiral Jayaratna mentioned, that we are obliged internationally to support this, because Article 51 of the United Nations Charter specifically deals with self-defense. And it is a matter of self-defense because it is the interest of all the nations whose cargo are represented in the ships that sail in this area. We have an international obligation to get engaged, whatever way, like employing our naval vessels and supporting logistically or in the warfare or whatever to face the scenarios of ballistic missiles and other drone attacks that are taking place. So there is the international obligation that we do have. When we look at the history, in the past, the vessels used to take a longer way when they came from Europe to the east, especially during the colonization of our country in particular. The Dutch, the Portuguese, the British, they used the Cape of Good Hope to travel towards Sri Lanka, because at that time there was no opening in the Suez Canal, and this Red Sea and the Mediterranean seas are semi-enclosed, and you need to have some kind of a way that can open up these seas to the main seas like the Indian Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean for the convenience of commercial shipping. And this is why we have now the Suez Canal. And you saw what happened when the Ever Given blocked the Suez Canal, how the international trade was affected, right? So likewise, in the Red Sea situation right now, there is huge threat to the international trade. And these international trade interests have affected not only Sri Lanka, but also the other parts of the East as the West, because we are frequently dealing with the import and export trade.
Dr. Dan, I'm trying to digest what you said about import and exports and Sri Lanka being a rather import-oriented economy. But if you look at the figures, Sri Lanka's import economy stands approximately around 16 billion US dollars only. This is a very small a drop of the ocean that we're talking about. Export bill is approximately around 12 billion US dollars. We're talking about a drop in the ocean as well. So this can't be the reason for the head of state to say that he's deploying a naval vessel just because we want to protect our interest for a paltry 16 billion US dollars.
Whatever the magnitude of the import trade in our country, everything relies upon the economic gains the country would have.
Because we have to see the expenditure as well. One of the points that Rear Admiral Jayaratne spoke about was the cost of deploying a vessel for 1 month stands approximately at 250 million Sri Lankan rupees. So you go for 4 months, that stands at approximately 1 billion Sri Lankan rupees. In terms of US dollars, we're talking about 3 million US dollars for 4 months. So I'm sure this is not the reason. The import bill or the export bill is not the reason Sri Lanka is deploying a naval vessel to the Red Sea. I find it very hard to digest for some reason.
As I told before, the importance of deploying, or the idea to deploy a vessel, is on the international obligation of cooperation. There is this concept in international law that the countries are obliged to cooperate in such a situation. So just leave it aside for now. Let us look at the export-import bill, for example. Doesn't it affect our economy? Right? We are talking about the freight rates, and the freight rates are going at the moment. The Sri Lanka European sector freight rate is about, say, USD $5 to $10. USD 5 to 10. If we cannot use this Red Sea sector, then we have to go all the way down to South Africa and take the Cape of Good Hope, and that would let our freight rates to increase by 45 to 50 or even 50 to 60. So which is about 9 times the present rate. And when you have such a huge freight increase, doesn't that affect the economy of Sri Lanka? I mean, our commodities will really become more expensive, and for the exports, we won't be able to compete with the other markets. And when it comes to imports, our expenditures, our goods, the commodities will increase.
But this is going to be, when it comes to exports, Dr. Dan, it's going to be it's going to be across the board. This is not only going to be for.
Yeah, I mean, our main.
So that's why I asked before, Nirandan. We have 197 countries registered with the United Nations. We have 100 countries in the world with navies. Why little Sri Lanka?
That is the fact that I told at the beginning. It is a solidarity, the international cooperation that we need to provide with the United Nations, and when the Security Council take a decision, being a member state.
If there was real solidarity, the solidarity announcement should be against what's happening in the Gaza Strip, and that is where the government should really express their opinions.
No, but our people are affected by trade. So that is where, as we see, the crux of the matter is for us to provide some sort of relief to our exporters and importers when it comes to commercial shipping. We are very much concerned about that, because I mean, we are dependent on the international trade when it comes to economy. So I don't think that it's a bad move.
No, it's not a bad move. So the reason is, Dr. Dan, On my full-time job is working in the export sector in the country, but not to date, nor the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, nor the government of Sri Lanka had told us about the issues in the Red Sea and how they are going to help exporters in the country to navigate through this whirlwind.
But haven't you experienced the freight increase?
Absolutely, we have. And this is going to impact, but again, at the end of the day.
So how are you going to compete with the other markets in that case?
So that's going to be endemic not only to Sri Lanka, it's going to be endemic to across the board. If people from India is going to send to South America, they have to use the same route. It's not going to only affect Sri Lanka.
Of course, ultimately, who is going to?
Sri Lanka ultimately is not competitive on many fronts because the economy is in dire straits. 18% VAT is the biggest problem right now when it comes to the country's economy. Why are we talking about sending a ship to Red Sea right now, when we have to talk about how to revive the country's economy? Shouldn't this be the order of the day at this very point of time?
So if you are talking about the increase of in the VAT, right, are you going to face some more increases in the commodity bills? I mean, these are the things that we have to address. How many people are dependent? This is entirely affecting the national economy. That's my point. No, so, but as long as the international law is concerned, we have a prime duty to cooperate. And under the charter, as I told you, that we do have a right to intervene in this because this is a kind of a precautionary measure. This is a kind of a precautionary measure under international law.
When all this is happening, Dr. Dan, just imagine the government goes and increases the 5,000 rupee allowances, which was supposed to come in April, then increases the doctor's allowance from 35,000 to 70,000 rupees. And then you, on top of that, you spend 251 million to fight someone else's war.
So the increase in allowances have to be addressed differently in this matter, because this is very very political.
Yeah, is this the priority right now in Sri Lanka?
It is not the priority right now in Sri Lanka, but it is becoming a priority for the whole world.
Right. Thank you very much, Dr. Dan. Neeraj.
So, Shamir, we live in a country where a head of state told the entire agriculture sector to stop using chemical fertilizer. So, in that sense, it's always good to question our national leaders from whatever party. That's what I feel. I'm sure all the farmers will agree as well. And that's just one bad decision. You could name a lot of presidents, a lot of prime ministers, with a lot of bad decisions, and that's what got us into this mess in the first place. So very clearly, the public and of course experts such as yourselves need to weigh in on any decision on anything by any government. Right, which is what we're doing here. We do this every week.
Every week.
Right. Now, while all this Red Sea talk was going on over the last few days, this morning, the State Minister of Finance announced that due to the hardships brought about over the last few weeks, especially the VAT situation and so on, cost of living, the number of families who are being, who will come under Aswasuma, the social scheme, security scheme, has been increased today to 2.4 million. That's 2.4 million families, which is 10 million people. So that's half our population are living in poverty.
So we have money.
So do we have money? Where do we have money from? Let's get Kusum's take on spending money to go on such adventures when we don't have money.
Look, I think if we're going to be critical of the government spending money in the Red Sea, we shouldn't be critical of the government spending money on Aswasuma, right? I mean, even the 5,000 rupees and the 35,000 rupees, okay, forget the 35,000 rupees, the 5,000 rupees, am I to begrudge someone in the state sector from earning a little extra, where I'm sure that person needs it as well, right? But it's just about, is there a plan to this? if you're going to give a salary increase to the public sector, have we undergone some sort of efficiency tests, rationalization tests? Are we looking at how we can move about the human capital in Sri Lanka to make things more efficient? I haven't seen any of that. My colleague mentioned the importance to the local economy in the Red Sea. No one is doubting that the issues in the Red Sea is important to Sri Lanka, to the global economy, to commercial trade. No one's doubting any of that. The argument is whether Sri Lanka can make a difference and whether we should be spending this money to make a difference. Aside from the fact that, of course, it's important to be involved in these joint exercises, you get experience, you can test out your equipment, great. The question is whether this is the time to do it, whether we can afford to do it. That's one question. On the economy and exports, I think Shamir must be aware, I think the Houthis are Iranian-backed. Iran is a friendly country to Sri Lanka. It's also a pretty big tea export market, if I'm not mistaken. It's also a country that we have a tea for oil barter arrangement right now. Does this bring any, that tea for barter has been going on since its MOU signed in December 2021. I think something like 5% of total packed tea goes to Iran. So in such a situation, I think if there's a benefit to the economy from our taking part in this Red Sea operation, we can also look at some of the costs, right? And that could be a cost to it. I can't say that Iran would cancel our barter agreement because of this arrangement, because I assume that it's a black op, or it's an under-the-table arrangement with the Houthi rebels that the Islamic Republic of Iran has. But that's one aspect. I want to just emphasize something else to the audience, and because I started with a critique of the Western American-led hegemony, if we call that. But I also want to point out the last 30, 40 years of human prosperity, of economic globalization, and the era that's brought people out of, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in China, in India. All of that is dependent on the global trade, on this era of global trade. And I just want to point out to the audience that who do you think has guaranteed this global trade regime? Right? It's the United States. So whether, and I've been critical of the United States, I write about it regularly. I think if I'm critical of any Western nation, it's usually the United States. But I think whether you are critical of US foreign policy, of neoliberalism, whether you're critical of their specific values, foreign intervention, you can't doubt the fact that they have done this job throughout the world. I think the Rear Admiral will know this very well. It's called FONOPS. They basically navigate the world's seas, not just seas that are under contention, but the common sea lanes. They've been doing it in the South China Sea. I think we can discuss some of that later on. So I think it's important, right, from that point of view. And let's also not forget, if we're talking about the economy, if we're talking about exports, our single largest export market is the United States. I think the European Union is the biggest market, but the single nation is the United States. That's a pretty big deal. I think given that our country's economy collapsed primarily because of a decades-long trade deficit, and exports to the United States make up a huge portion of our total exports, I don't think we have to look at all these numbers and try to justify this Red Sea operation in that way. The fact of the matter is, one of our major global trading partners, one of the major power nations in the world, a global hegemon, has or may have asked us to get involved, right? So from there on, whether we can afford it, whether it's a good idea, whether it's not, that's why I asked the question at the beginning in my opening remarks, did we have a choice? Okay, so I'm going to assume that maybe we didn't have a choice, because at the end of the day, we are also dependent on the IMF, we're also dependent on...
Are you trying to say, Kusum, someone twisted the president's arm to agree to
I think, Shamir, that the twisting of arms is quite commonplace, especially when the power dynamics reflect Sri Lanka, United States, right? And at the end of the day, I'm sure President Wickremesinghe may struggle to say no to something like this. Because on the other hand, remember that before October 7th, President Wickremesinghe, without being asked, he called for a resolution to the Palestinian conflict. He did that on 2 or 3 occasions abroad in a Western country, right? So I have to give him his props for that. And on the other side, we also called for a ceasefire, We voted with the United Nations, with the majority of nations, the United Nations calling for a cessation of hostilities in the Gaza Strip. So he may have painted himself into a corner when the request came in from the United States to ask, can we give a ship? Perhaps he was in a situation where he didn't want to say no, or maybe he couldn't say no. Like I said before, what I'd like to know is at least play the public relations game a little better. You know, it's good if the rest of the world, maybe to some extent, knows that Sri Lanka is involved, because it's not going to be a secret, right? We are talking about it right now, so everyone knows. Maybe in a couple of weeks there'll be a ship going. In that case, let's get some credit for it, at least from the people that are on one side, because the rest of the world will look at us and say, oh, look at Sri Lanka, they are sending a ship and they're on the side of Israel, you know?
Right. So
you can't look at things like that all the time.
So Rear Admiral, we spoke about whether Sri Lanka has the technology to go and fight, not fight, but at least have a offshore patrolling unit for the first time. When it comes to technology in the naval arena, it's very costly. And this is not the time that we can spend our money on something like this, because you have to be very wise in spending money. At the same time, you have to be very lavish as well. If not, you won't be able to get all this equipment on board. How do we do that?
I will step in Shamir, in this way. At one point of time, you mentioned about why Sri Lanka, why this small island. Well, in the power politics in the Indian Ocean, it is the US-led camp want us to be on their camp, and the China camp want us to be in their camp. So there's a competition. There's always push and pull pressure on Sri Lankan government. So it looked like, although we don't want to be a part of Quad, or we want to be a part of US camp, but it looked like we are lining ourselves into that part. Now let us understand that anything on matters maritime, decision cannot be made on impulse, because matters maritime are complex issues. Their repercussions are multifaceted. So that is why the head of state or the political masters has to make very wise decision on matters maritime. So these are the decisions a single person will not be taking. So these are the decisions a body of people.
We hope.
We don't know that for sure.
Yeah. So we are in a vacuum. So we are in a vacuum. We don't know about. We are not privy to that. What went behind the screen, but it looked like.
How does it happen normally? Now, you have been in the Navy for nearly 34 years, Rear Admiral. So tell us, who takes these decisions, and how does it boil down to the ranks in the Naval Command?
Okay, let me go a little bit into history also. In 1950, when the government want to send the sacred tooth lyrics to Myanmar, the Burma, on a goodwill gesture, obvious choice was the ship. So the naval ship was tasked for it. So he took that the sacred tooth lyric to Myanmar and brought it back, Burma. During the wartime, it is the Navy led. Navy realized that we need to go after them. But there was no political will to do that. But when the political will and military will synergize, there was a decision, go after. So how to go after? Navy was perfectly in place to make up an operational plan for that and to go. But here in this case, to my knowledge, it was discussed at the Security Council, but I don't know how far and how in depth these were discussed. But it looked like government has to navigate very wisely to keep us away from someone else's camp, and at the same time to operate, because these kind of issues gives us opportunities. Now, for example, Colombo port transshipment cargo has gone up. Why? Now all the cargo that is been destined to Gulf and on the Central Asian market are being unloaded in Colombo, because ships are not going to that part. So all of a sudden we see an opportunity. And similar way, we see an opportunity for Sri Lanka Navy to be a coalition partner. See, So in a global naval arena, these things matters. How much you want to be an active partner in the club.
All right, so Kusum spoke about how we should be able to test our equipment, because we know in 1998 how we tested the Israeli thermal cameras in the country, and they used that as a point to sell the products worldwide. But in order to test these, let's say the rationale was to test offshore patrolling class vessels. Is it so high tech that we have right now that it has to be tested in an ocean like the Red Sea?
Well, it is without this equipment, you are bound to make mistakes at sea. See, identification becomes very critical.
So my question is, let me rephrase that, Rear Admiral. So if you were to advise the Sri Lanka president, hypothetically, again I'm saying it hypothetically, what would be your advice if President Ranil Wickremesinghe spoke to and said, YN Jayaratna, tell me, are we to send a ship to the Red Sea? What would be your advice?
I would say first we need some stabilized detection systems.
You don't get an option to say give your answer. You're only given the task of answering a yes or a no first. What would your answer be?
I would take it. I would say let's go. But I need this.
But what would you need?
First thing is the detection equipment, stabilized systems.
How much would that cost approximately?
Well, now these days it's a competitive market, but I'm sure when you go for crisis purchase, the prices is.
So how much? What are the other equipments you would want?
Well, these are OPV class vessels that we are looking at that have the strategic reach and sustainability for weeks and months. So obviously the equipment that are going to fit on this will be a long range, not what we used on our.
So how much would the cost be approximately?
It will be 35 million to 40 million US dollars.
That is like our gas bill a month. So
Yes.
can we afford that?
Well, you have to ask from the government whether the government would like to pay for it. Someone has to pay for it, so it is the government has to pay for it. If the government wants naval ships to be there, the government better pay it. So then,
but the government also can take the option, the wise option of not doing that.
Yeah, there's something called be there, but not to be there. So in words, you commit yourself, you go, but you don't operate in the hot zones.
Right.
You don't operate on the periphery. You operate somewhere in vicinity. So the opportunity what I see is here, we'll grab it, we'll go and operate where our national interests lie.
Right.
Our national interest lies on the Arabian Sea northern part because of the drugs. Because what we know is that in 2019 I was the DG operations. When we decided to go into Arabian Sea, we asked from Combined Maritime Force and the Indian Navy support, but both of them declined, telling that they don't have assets. The bottom line is they don't want to utilize vessels for our job. So we went. Sri Lanka Navy went and we start arresting these guys. So this is a good opportunity for us to operate in this unfamiliar area and to look after our own national interest. On the pretext of protecting the sea lane of communication, not to fight someone else's war, but to meet our own national interests. So these are become opportunities we get in these conflicts.
So we have a question for Dr. Dan. An estimated 17% of Sri Lanka's 22 million population is food insecure, according to the FAO WFP Corporation Food Security Assessment Mission report of 2023. Against such a backdrop, why are we prioritizing deploying ships to the Red Sea?
I don't see it as a priority. It is, as I again say, it's our obligation. I always stand by the international law, and in international law, we do have the obligation to stand with the international community at large. And when it comes to the Law of the Sea Convention, Sri Lanka play a leading role. And Sri Lanka has a duty to protect our sea areas and shipping interests when it comes to maritime law. And when we take all these air segments of international law, law of the sea and maritime law, we do have a prime duty to safeguard the interests of all these stakeholders. And that is the reason why we should participate. This is a participatory thing. It is not an individual effort. And I mentioned before that this is a de facto government that we are engaged in a kind of a war situation. It is not a government that was democratically elected in Yemen, and this is a militia. But as Kusum very correctly mentioned, when it comes to international geopolitics, Sri Lanka is a neutral state, right? Sri Lanka has friendly relations with Iran, and that's the reason that I told at the beginning that this will not be our Waterloo, right? But to safeguard our commercial interests in this respect, if we lose these opportunities, our export-import industry will get heavily affected, and ultimately it will affect our national economy. Now we are talking about a sea lane. What Admiral Jayaratne is talking about is a sea lane of communication that we have very fast-moving and expeditious. If we go around South Africa's Cape Hope, there, then the navigation part alone will take 14 days extra than taking the Red Sea and the Mediterranean.
Right. So Dr. Dan, you spoke of the Battle of Waterloo. So the Battle of Waterloo was on the 18th of June 1815 between the with Napoleon and the Duke of Wellington, and this lasted for nearly 23 years. So we presume that this won't last for 23 years, that's for sure. But however, the money that
it's a land battle.
Yeah, so it's going to be very difficult. It's not going to be easy, you know. At the end of the day, fighting a war in the seas, not knowing who your enemy is and from where they are firing. Now, yesterday alone, there were 21 missiles that were fired from inland to the seas. So you can't even see the enemy. So is this a fight that we should be involved in?
Now, let's look at this. You know, it's true that Waterloo took 23 years, and we have had wars, cold wars, that have lasted even more, less or more. Let's take it like that. Now, I don't see that this particular situation is going to last for a short term. It may continue for a long term, because looking at the situations in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, and now this Red Sea issue, we have seen pirate issues in Somalia. The pirates were acting very actively, and during that time, even Sri Lankan maritime industry had opportunities.
Yeah, but
opportunities.
But Dr. Dan, we have to all admit, we were fighting Somali pirates. Here we are fighting rebels who have missiles.
So Shamir, let me bring in Nilantan here. What do we know about the Houthis, which is not on Google, obviously. I'm sure everyone's Googled Houthis. But what do our armed forces know? Have we done a proper threat assessment? Do we know, now they have made the threat that any country which joins this coalition is fair game. So do we know if they can strike us here in Sri Lanka? What kind of threat assessment have we done before taking this decision? Again, a decision by a president.
We should not forget, Niresh, that the Saudi government has been fighting the Yemenis, the Houthi rebels, for nearly 20 years.
Yeah.
20 years. You know, there has not been any side who has been declared victorious. And ultimately, the Saudi government withdrew from attacking the points in Yemen because they were spending too much of money. on that war.
Yeah, so as you said, this is the 20th anniversary of the Houthi rebellion. It started in 2004, and it's the 10th anniversary of their first major military victory, where they took control of the capital. So from September 2014 to around February 2015, these guys actually controlled the capital for a few months as well. Now, in terms of what we do know about them, there's a general knowledge gap about the Houthi rebels all over the world. And the reason is because unlike ISIS and Al-Qaeda, when we look at the 20-year timeline of the Houthis, they aren't really the type to orchestrate distant terror attacks in Western Europe, North America, South Asia, Southeast Asia. So they're not as well known as, let's say, an ISIS or an Al-Qaeda would be, because they're quite localized to what they need in that region. So that's one thing. We know very little about them. The few things we do know about them, number one, as was pointed out, we know that they're backed by Iran. We know that they're backed by Iran through covert means. And once again, this cost issue comes in. I mean, when we talk about just how much we need to spend to counter this, there are about 3 or 4 American destroyer vessels operating there right now. The Mason, the Laboon, the Carney. The Iranian drones and missiles being fired at them in some cases are as cheap as $2,000 or $1,000. And the cruise missiles being sent to intercept them in some cases are as expensive as $1 million. So can you imagine? They send a projectile that costs them about $2,000, and the countering cruise missile costs us about $1 million or $2 million. So there's a major cost disparity here as well. The third thing that we need to keep in mind about the Houthis is that because they are a Shia organization, they are not as plugged in to the global terror network per se. However, there are terror groups who could easily use this as an excuse, as a pretext to attack us. As in, even though the Houthi rebels themselves, their modus operandi might not be to target distant countries through terror attacks and things like that, there are other terror organizations that could just use this as rationale for doing whatever they wanted to do in the first place. So they're a bit of an enigma. We know that ceasefires, for example, don't work with the Houthi rebels. In the first 6 years of the Houthi rebellion, there were about 3 ceasefires, and within a year it was broken. The rebellion broke out in 2004. 2005 ceasefire, 2006 they start fighting. 2007 there's a ceasefire, in 2008 they go back to fighting. Early 2010 there's a ceasefire, by late 2010 they've gone back to fighting. So even if you look at the 2010s and onwards, ceasefires with the Houthis have only resulted in temporary pauses in the violence. So there doesn't seem to be a long-term strategic plan in play in terms of how they're going to be neutralized either.
So Nirantan, issuing a statement, the Houthi rebels have said that whoever joins forces with the U.S. To stop their war against Israel would be targeted and would feel the consequences later on. So you mentioned earlier that nearly 20 countries have supported the mission to fight the Houthi rebels in the Red Sea, and only out of that 10 countries have been so far named,
around, yes,
approximately.
Yeah.
Is Sri Lanka trying to do a covert operation in the Red Sea?
I mean, this would be a bad example of a covert operation where all of us are sitting here and actually discussing it. Look, the rationale that I would accept is the Rear Admiral's rationale that if we are doing this strategically to upgrade the quality and the vision of the Sri Lankan Navy, then it's a conversation that we can have in terms of the long-term interest. I am, to be honest, not that convinced by the international law argument, because there are many countries like Norway, Denmark, Australia, Canada that are not sending in warships. They're just sending in, as I mentioned, personnel, and I'm sure those countries care about international law as well. So there are other things that we can do. I mean, so as was rightly pointed out by the doctor, when we look at the Convention on the Law of the Sea, I think it's Article 87, which guarantees freedom of passage. And that's the article that we would need to invoke as a legal basis for whatever we do here. But in general, do we actually have a certain amount of strategic insight into what we would do once the unpredictable starts happening, that's where the worry is. There are certain things we can predict, but what's our plan when the unpredictable starts happening?
Right. So, Kusum, I have a question for you from one of our viewers. Interesting conversation. A lot of people are sending questions. I'm trying to take them as much as possible. Some, unfortunately, I can't take because those are comments and views expressed by our viewers. But we can take this question. Why send Navy to the Red Sea? Can we afford it? Not so long ago, the president went to the IMF hoping the country to be revived because the country's economy was in shambles. Most importantly, are we sending troops to the Red Sea and asking every citizen of Sri Lanka of 18 years to open a tax file?
I think the interesting question here is the way in which decisions are made. I think we started at the beginning of the program, we talked about the Gotabaya, some of the Gotabaya decisions. What was...
Not just Gotabaya, many of our presidents.
But I think it's interesting, specifically if we start from Gotabaya, even go back to Mahinda Rajapaksa, even go back to Yahapalanya. We know that in Sri Lanka there's a culture of where when you're at the top, if it's with Prime Minister during Yahapalanya, and usually it's a president, the president at the top is where most of the policy seems to come through. Now, this is what went wrong for us, in my personal opinion. Most of the time, we see a lack of deliberation, a lack of collaboration when it comes to policy making. And it's just on the overall policy thinking of the president. Now, I wonder in this case whether President Wickremesinghe has, for example, had meetings with the foreign ministry, if he's taken that the geopolitical aspects into consideration when he made this decision. And is he making this decision on his own? Has he for example, asked the cabinet? Has he at least put a paper to the cabinet? I don't think Parliament has been informed about this as yet. I'm not sure if President Wickremesinghe is if he's the kind of person who takes advice from Parliament. That's not up to me to say. When we talked about the Houthis before, I just wanted to point out a few things. I Googled it since everyone else will. The fact is that we mentioned the Al-Houthis, his name is Al-Houthi. He was killed in 2005, but in 2004, he made a statement that I think rings true today, and I think it's his cousin that's currently the leader of the Houthis. He said in 2004, we will not become American puppets. We will not sit back and watch as the Jews mess around in Muslim countries, right? Now, the Zaydi Islamic sect that he belongs to is a Shia community. And there's a very large Shia community on the Yemeni-Saudi Arabia border, which is where most of the Saudi Arabia-Yemeni conflict took place. In 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, Yemen, the government in position at the time in Yemen was one of the few countries which said that no other countries outside the Arab Peninsula, no non-Arab countries should not be involved in trying to prevent the Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. One of the countries that, when Yemen did that in the Security Council, within the next 2 years, 800,000 Yemenis were expelled from Saudi Arabia, just during those 2 years. So I think, and you mentioned the war that started in 2014 and the operation that went in 2016. We've seen something like 300,000 civilians killed in the Saudi-Yemen conflict. And that includes people that have died of starvation, famine, disease, lack of supplies. Now, just think of we know in Sri Lanka what war is like. Take this, forget war, take the tsunami, we lost 100,000 people in a natural disaster. This is 300,000 people within 4 or 5 years that have died as a result of, and indirectly and directly as a result of this. So the stakes are extremely high, and I just want to, because we may be on the periphery of the combat zone in the Red Sea, but let's not forget that this is part of a wider global theater of conflict. So just recently, a few days ago, Hezbollah launched an attack at there's 2 main Air Force bases in Israel. The main northern base, it's Air Force base in Meron, and they struck several targets with anti-aircraft missiles, to the extent that even the Iron Dome and the anti-aircraft defense systems of the Israeli Air Force base could not protect it. And now we've heard that the air traffic control, the military air traffic control of that base is out, and they have to bring in reinforcements. We've also seen that Israel has bombed a Hamas leader in Beirut. We know that Hamas is still targeting Israel proper with missiles regularly, maybe hundreds of missiles per day some days. We know that Israel has also bombed in Syria. So we are seeing this war in Gaza is spilling over into all sorts of other areas in the world. This is not
don't
just
you think, Kusum, given the fact that what's happening right now in the world, it would be easier for all the countries to unite and ask Israel to stop what they're doing in Gaza?
I think they have, Shamir. That's kind of the interesting thing. I mean, if you look at the United Nations Security Council, every single nation has voted for a ceasefire except for Israel, the United States, and Micronesia, and a few islands in the Caribbean. So I think there's a very clear global sort of point that's being made about what's happening in the Gaza Strip. But it's just not changing any minds. And I think if Sri Lanka is going to, let's say, take a position, we have taken the right position at the United Nations. But these are peripheral issues that come up. We may treat them as peripheral issues. But until this war suddenly comes to our doorstep, we don't know, right? We just don't know. Even when the Easter attack happened, one of the first things that was said about it was that it was retaliation for the shooting in New Zealand, in Christchurch, right? So, the Houthi rebels have never had any global ambitions. They are fighting for, I think it's in the north of Yemen, they want to resurrect the Zaidi culture and the Zaidi area. So that's a separate...
Who is funding them?
Most of the reporting suggests it's Iran. And it would be hard to look past Iran because the original Hussein al-Houthi had very close links to the Ayatollah Khamenei. So I think that relationship is still what's propping up the Houthi rebels. And I think it's important to notice for our audience that the Houthi rebels have said they are fighting this, they are attacking ships in the Red Sea to cause damage to Israel's economy. And when there was a 9-day ceasefire in December, as far as I know, I might be wrong, as far as I know, there were no attacks by the Houthi rebels on ships in the Red Sea in that 9-day ceasefire agreement, and it restarted after the ceasefire ended. So I'm not trying to justify the Houthi rebels' attacks on commercial shipping. Attacks on commercial shipping should not happen, period. But neither should a virtual genocide or an ethnic cleansing or war crimes in the Gaza Strip. So the fact of the matter is that we can say this shouldn't be happening, but we should also say that whatever geopolitical issues may relate to it, the operation of Israel in the Gaza Strip is counterproductive to global security, and that's a fact.
Let me ask the Admiral, can you ever underestimate a terror group or a guerrilla group or whatever you want to call them? After all, we have seen, for example, 9/11. Who ever dreamt that a terror group would hijack 4 aircraft and drive them into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon and cause so much havoc in the United States? Certainly no American dreamt of that. So that's halfway around the world. But here we are not that far from Yemen, just a couple of flights away, few hours.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the warfare has changed a lot, and the war fighting has changed a lot. So you cannot predict, and you can look at the trends, you can look at the ways and the strength and the weaknesses, but how it will happen, because it will be targeting the economies. No longer these non-state actors will be targeting military per se. Need not to be, because that's the way it is. Now we talk about the Houthis being there for last 20 years. So if the US is so powerful and things, if they can go to Afghanistan and control that whole part, why not they concentrate on Houthis part? Because if you do something on the Bab el-Mandab and the land strip that is adjoining it, there will be repercussion in the Strait of Hormuz. And Strait of Hormuz, any repercussion, any effect will be disastrous. You see, so this is the way things are happening, the geopolitics. It is that not only the government have the power, it is the non-state actors also have the power. So it is better that we not talk about next conflict in this even country, because we don't know how, in what format it will come. You see, now what if the Houthis decided, okay, the Sri Lanka is now a partner to this, and because of the Hamas-Palestinian issue, our tourism industry has boomed in the southern side, our season, in the southern coastline, it is the tourist season now, it's all filled up. It is because of the tourism. The tourists are destined to go for Middle East and these countries, now they end up here. So what if, as you mentioned, one of their elements decided to do something here? Have we done any threat assessment? I don't think so.
No, but Rear Admiral, you're the one who said initially that if President Ranil Wickremesinghe hypothetically asks you whether we should go there, you said yes. But now you're saying no.
But that's going there.
Yeah, see, looking at two different angles. As a Navy, as the Navy, it is the golden opportunity. As I said earlier, it is an opportunity that present in a conflict. To Navy to rise up and to be a partner in the global club, to have our mark made up, is a different story. But as a country, are we going to pay for it? So these are the things at the Security Council level we need to argue and debate about. And as I said earlier, matters maritime cannot be decided by one person. It's very dangerous. We have seen these things happen. When the things were not going good in Argentina in 1982, the Argentinian junta thought that they will invade the Falkland Islands. So there are distractions. There are ample of examples like that around the world. How the countries, how the government distract their internal politics to something else and ended up being in the worst condition. So let us learn from all these things. Let us look very broadly.
Let us learn from all these things and not go.
Well, it's up to the government to decide. So if you weigh these things all up, do we have any other options?
No, the problem is, Rear Admiral, going to the Red Sea, being part of the controlling collision patrolling is all well and good. But are we in a situation to spend that money? Look at Sri Lanka. You go to a supermarket or you go to a vegetable shop. A kilo of onions is going at 520
I didn't make the
rupees.
decision, Shamir. Let's say
a kilo of carrot is 700 rupees. If you buy a little bit of brinjals, you buy a capsicum, you buy onions, you buy tomatoes, 1,200 rupees.
Absolutely, I agree with you. It is up
and
to
we
the
are spending
public.
251 million for 6 weeks to go and fight someone else's.
It will be more than that. It will be more than that.
And now the Admiral mentioned tourism. Now at a time when tourism is recovering, picking up so well, all it would take is one failed attempt at violence to drive the tourists away from Sri Lanka. So again, there are other risks, very real risks. Like I said, a failed attempt would do it.
The BBC have actually just reported in the last half an hour that the United Kingdom and the US have repelled the largest Houthi rebel attack on a Red Sea commercial ship. Something like 25 drone attacks. Yeah. Now, each drone apparently costs 17,000 pounds. That's the cost to Iran or the Houthi rebels. I shouldn't have said Iran, it's the Houthi rebels, right? The missiles that the UK and the US have used to shoot down these drones cost about £1 million per missile. Yeah. So just now, the BBC article has quoted the analysis by Frank Gardner, security correspondent, saying that, quoting UK defense officials, saying that direct action against the Houthi rebels is now a possibility because the maths isn't mathing for them, right? Because they are spending millions and millions of pounds to shoot down a 17,000 pound drone. Yeah, so they'd rather attack the Houthi rebels directly. So that means that's a direct attack on a nation. We can call it a de facto government. We can call it a rebel movement, but they are in charge at least of half or maybe a third of Yemen. And Yemen borders Saudi Arabia. So I know that we are on the periphery, but the periphery might be getting closer. So it's something that we should keep an eye on.
So, Dr. Dan, the Bab al-Madad Strait, the narrow and hazardous channel between Yemen and Djibouti, forms a gateway to the Red Sea from the south. Now, the significance of this trade route is that 17,000 ships pass through this channel, and that means 10% of the global trade passes through this area annually. How important is it for the major powerhouses to have one voice?
Now, when you look at the world trade, over 80% of world trade passes through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea, right? It's about 60% of vessels passes through take these routes, and the rest are the other sides of the world. So we see that there is a high density here, high density of trade, high density of the exchange of commodities that are taking place. Now, when you look at this particular strait, whether it's the Suez Canal or the Red Sea, this area where that intercepts Djibouti and Yemen, like Nilanjan said, that it's not the law of the sea convention that we should alone look at Article 87, but as a matter of fact, it's a strait, and in a strait you should allow the vessels to pass without any kind of interruption, right? Like we saw in the Corfu Channel case, for example. What happened in the Corfu Channel case in 1949? The British vessels were attacked by sea mines, by Albania. Albanian sea mines attacked the British vessels, and then the International Court of Justice decided on a proportionality test, that how proportionate it is for the interest of both the user as well as the countries that are facing the strait, right? So likewise here in this situation, we have to apply the same concept of proportionality. Now you're talking about the national, the loss we are experiencing economically. It is true that our people have been put on with a huge tax now, with a huge VAT now, but however, we also have to look at the proportionality test of having of safeguarding the national interest, the national interest on the commercial aspects, the economic aspects, right? Especially when it comes to international trade, it's not only the Sri Lankan goods are passing, it's also the goods that are in transshipment in Sri Lanka, like Admiral mentioned before. The transshipment trade has grown in the port of Colombo because of this situation. So we have to look at this particular area, how the proportionality test would affect Sri Lanka's economy at large. So it is not only the economy, Shabir, it is also the politics.
So Dr. Nan, when there are major powerhouses just around our neighboring countries, example India, Pakistan, China, don't you think that if we take a sit back and wait approach, they will solve the problem for us because their economies are much more larger, their exports are much more larger, their imports are much more larger. Don't you think if we sit back and wait for them to solve this problem, don't you think that this problem will be solved without costing Sri Lanka in money? Because we're talking about, as I said before, 16 billion import bill and 12 billion export bill. Look at the import bill of India, look at the import bill of Pakistan, look at the export bill of India, look at the export bill of China. They will solve this problem for us. We don't have to put our tiny finger in this mess. We will just go from the frying pan into the fire, don't you think?
No, it is not a sit-back policy here. It is like earlier Vayan mentioned, we are a strategically located country, right? So our biggest advantage is this strategic location. On one side, India is trying to grab us. On the other side, China is trying to grab us. So the importance here is not the size of our economy, if I'm correct, right? It's not the size of economy that is important. It is the location that is important for us. It is the location that is important for India as well as for China. To have the Sri Lankan location And this is what we are really fighting at, and trying to grab the entire economic advantage to Sri Lanka. It is not politics. It is not the political advantage that we are looking at. We are looking at the economic advantage. That is why we should go into an area where that would give us.
How would China and India take advantage of Sri Lanka not fighting or sending a battleship to the Red Sea?
There is nothing to do with.
Absolutely.
No, there is nothing to do with employing a vessel in the Red Sea. No, not at all.
Yeah,
not at all. And
So
if you look at the location.
How can you draw a parallel?
No, the thing is that since we are strategically located, right, our economic advantages that we should gain is much bigger than the political advantage.
Any ship that goes towards a particular country, they will have to touch down in
Exactly.
in Colombo,
Exactly.
whether or not there is a fight in the Red Sea or not. There is immaterial. The Chinese vessels will touch down the port in Hambantota. It goes without saying.
True.
So how would Sri Lanka sending a offshore patrolling class vessel is going to help?
It is like YN mentioned that our.
No, tell us economically, Dr. Dana. You're saying economically Sri Lanka has to not sit back and wait, because we have to go there and we have to fight. Okay, let's say we take your argument at this point on the surface. How would Sri Lanka gain that benefit? Let's say Sri Lanka doesn't send a vessel. Won't Sri Lanka gain the same benefit by just waiting?
No, it is not actually that we are sending a vessel to fight, because we don't have the capability of fighting.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we don't
Absolutely.
have. But logistically,
if Sri Lanka had the thermal cameras that Rear Admiral Jayarathne was talking about, I understand. If we had the capability of testing one of our equipment in the seas, understood. But nothing. We are just sending a vessel because I don't know why.
the reasons is that we have a logistical advantage of logistically associating in a crisis situation. And it is a learning opportunity as well.
Learning of that part I get, but economic, right? that part we can somewhat digest it. But what I can't digest is how can we gain economic advantage? Do you think, Dr. Dan, just because we send a vessel to the Red Sea
those are
tomorrow,
two different things.
Just because we send a vessel to the Red Sea tomorrow, the US is going to say all our transshipment ports will come to Colombo. All our transshipment shipments from India, we are going to divert to Colombo. Will that happen?
No.
That will never happen.
No, that is why I said
that will never happen.
Even Sri Lanka will not.
Advantage.
This will not be a Waterloo for Sri Lanka. That is how I started.
Yeah.
That this will not be a Waterloo, because it is not the fact that we are going to fight. It is not a fact that
this may be a goodwill.
Exactly.
Goodwill journey.
Yes.
See, it is. We are not the game changer here. We will be it will be a demonstrating our commitment to the maritime security. That we are there to ensure
that is understood. As I said, when Dr. Dan said economically we can gain advantage, I don't see merits on that front.
No, why not? Because
underneath this conflict, there are opportunities.
Yes, but Admiral, you said we are not going to be a game changer in the Red Sea. But the Red Sea conflict, if it comes home here, like I said, even a failed attempt here, we are gambling our entire tourism industry. And can we afford that right now?
We cannot.
Remember, tourism is not like your tea, Shamir, okay? You can't blow up tea, but one threat, and that's it. So can we afford this? Because tourism is one of the few industries which is doing well right now in Sri Lanka.
I perfectly agree. That is why I repeatedly say that these kind of matters, maritime, need to be in-depth studied before someone make the decision. Whether it has happened, we don't know. We are not privy to any of those information. All of a sudden, it was on the media, and there's how-who about these things. That's all what we know. You cannot. You cannot make decisions like that. So let's be very careful. Let's hope our political masters are wiser enough to not to do that mistake again and again.
That I don't know.
We are hoping that the Navy did not learn of this operation through the media.
No. I think Navy commander knew about it.
Knew about it. When? After the president announced it in the media?
Well, I'm sure they must be communicating. I'm sure.
Shamir, I also mentioned that the Americans basically patrol the sea lanes throughout the world, right? So they have these freedom of navigation operations all around the world. One of the places where it's most in contention is in the South China Sea. Now, why is it in contention? One of the reasons the South China Sea is in contention is because China has built up hundreds of artificial islands in that South China Sea. The total land area that the Chinese government has reclaimed in the South China Sea is about 3,200 acres. Now, several times in the last 2-3 years, there have been American ships that have navigated in those waters, in the international waters that China considers as theirs in the South China Sea. And the United States has purposefully gone into those areas as a show of strength, as to say that we don't agree with you, that we don't accept that this is part of Chinese territorial waters. So I just want to ask the audience if you can think of any other Chinese reclaimed land that is somewhere close to home, which has created another artificial island. And that's just something food for thought. And also, when we talk about the political angle, the United States has by far one of the most powerful, or the most powerful navy in the world, right?
First is China, second is...
anyone would ask, why can't the US handle this Red Sea on its own? But let's assume they don't want all their naval assets in one place, so they also have to hedge their bets because they can't bring all their carriers and warships to the same place. There's another reason, right? The other reason is the United States already has to play a public relations game around the Israel-Palestine conflict. President Biden's polling has collapsed off a cliff to the point where he's now losing in every swing state that he was previously winning in before October 7. So they have to also manage public relations. Part of the reason, that's part of the reason why they want this global coalition. When they call for the global coalition for Operation Prosperity Guardian, they named 20 nations, but they said 20 nations are taking part, but they only named 12. And they said, we'll leave it to the other nations to mention that they're taking part. Well, the fact of the matter is that France, Italy, and Spain, which are pretty big allies, have all rejected joining the coalition. They have said they have naval assets. They will have their naval assets as per usual under EU or NATO control, but they won't join the American-led coalition. Why is that? That's also because of public relations. So even these major nations that are allies of the United States, that are European Union nations, they're also keeping a little bit of space to maneuver in terms of this specific operation. So that's something that I think is important to impress upon your audience, because this is something everyone's taking into consideration.
Yeah, can I, Shamit, add something on here? See, let's not unduly alarm our audience onto that. Let's not forget the role that China is playing here. Whatever it is, China was able to broker a peace deal with Iranian and Saudis. It was done. So, to my analysis, the Pakistan also played a huge role underneath that. So let's not forget that. So these things are working. There will be some overt operations, covert operation, not in the military terms, but on diplomatical circle. So there will be many things that are happening. So our job is to analyze all those things and make a decision. So I'm sure when we go into this one, we are not going to jump into the hot zone or the ground zero. We'll be given an appropriate place in our coalition partnership under Combined Maritime Force program. So there'll be, I'm sure there'll be operations.
Who would be the authority that the Navy would be reporting to?
Well, see, when you operate under coalition, the commanding officer of that ship has the authority to decide what to do and what to know. If it is too risky, he has the liberty to not to go there. And if it is a too risky operation and need, decision, the head of state.
Yeah, give us some context, Rear Admiral, with regard to what happened with companies like Avantgarde, Blackwater in the Somali pirates matter. Those were private companies
Yes.
who were working in that area, in that stretch, to fight Somali pirates. Why can't private organizations like this go to the through the Red Sea and deploy their personnel?
Right. So let me take you back to something like 2009. When Somalian piracy started, there was an opportunity for our industry, that is private maritime security companies, PMSCs, started. So the Britishers start working on that, and Avantgarde is one of those maritime security companies that are using their manpower. They have a manpower agency. They didn't have weapons, so they made an agreement with the Lanka to get the weapons. So that is how they deploy. They are just a business entity only. So the business entity tried, because all the insurance companies wanted to have these private maritime security providers on board merchant ship because of the piracy issue. So as it go along, it got gradually withdrawn, and on 1st of January 2023 onward, the high risk area was cancelled. Now it is no more. Then this issue came up. Now when the Houthis came up again, these companies were talking about deploying them again. But deploying them against what? They were trained for the boarding, pirates, small boats, skiffs. But there's a difference this time. It is the drone, the missiles, helicopters. So the dimension has changed. It has gone beyond the private companies. So the government has to, navies has to step in, because it's beyond the private security companies' capabilities. So drone come in close to you, yes, the private security guards on board will be able to do something. We saw it, the kind of a damage it has done to the Indian ship, Indian flag merchant vessel. It was on the net. So it's a kind of a considerable damage on the stern part of the ship. So that means it is beyond that. So these are kind of it is beyond it. Yeah, it is not that just pirates and small boats, it is three-dimensional.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your thoughts. Let's take a final round, but before that I just want to ask Nilandan. Nilandan, what are your thoughts? What must a government like Sri Lanka do at this point of time? My question again relates to what I asked Dr. Dan. Can't we take a sit back and wait approach and let the big powerhouses fight this battle and give us the benefit? We don't have to be in the deep end. We can be in the shores and say, bring us the fish. We will get it without mudding our hands or legs. Can't we do that?
So under the current circumstances, that might be the best option. As the Rear Admiral said, you be there, but you don't actually be there. As part of a symbolic and diplomatic gesture, you are there in the vicinity rather than in the periphery. And you can get some kind of benefit diplomatically also from that. Look, this is not going to end unless there's an actual land invasion of Yemen. That's the major problem. These missiles are coming from too deep from Yemeni territory. You have to invade Yemen for this to stop. If not, it's not going to stop. And we were speaking about the tragedy in Gaza at the moment. An invasion of Yemen would be 10 times worse than that. 80% of Yemen will already starve to death if it wasn't for international humanitarian aid, mass starvation, mass outbreaks of cholera, mass famines. But unfortunately, the attacks are coming from too deep in. The Saudis have been bombing Yemen back to the Stone Age for a decade now. It's not worked. This maritime effort that we are making, we might secure the Strait and the Red Sea in general, but this will not stop unless the Houthis are stopped from inside Yemeni territory, and that's not going to be possible unless you're willing to risk an even bigger humanitarian disaster than Gaza.
So don't you see an end to this problem anytime soon?
My take on it is far more pessimistic than most people. I generally don't think there will ever be peace in the Jerusalem, Middle East region in general. I think we've been fighting over it for 5,000 years, and we will continue to fight over it for another 5,000 years. That particular area is something that I'm quite pessimistic on. For as long as humanity fights over territory, Jerusalem and that area will be one of the territories we fight over, simply because of the way it connects Europe and Asia, the way it connects Central Asia and South Asia and West Asia and things like that. So,
Dr. Dan, do you see an end to this conflict?
That's what I mentioned even before, that it's very hard to see an end. Like the existing conflicts in Ukraine, and then in Gaza, the territory of Israel and Hamas, and these are all historic. Like Dilantan said, they had been there for 5,000 years and will continue for another 5,000 years. We don't know, and even this. But you know, when it comes to commercial shipping, there has to be certain steps that need to be taken. I have been supportive of that, not about the politics. You know,
Right.
my concern and my take was on the commercial shipping part, and also the gains that we have in the international trade. We were talking about tourism, how it will affect the tourism industry. Have we done any research? We are talking about certain area without any data or any kind of evidence on the table, right? But when it comes to trade, when it comes to shipping, yes, we do have. We see the rising freight costs. We see the dangers of taking the vessels for a longer time if we go down the South African lanes, right? So these are something that are very, very practical, right? But when it comes to tourism, of course, we have to do further research to see whether we will lose the opportunities there. You know?
So Kusum, just one final question from me. We're talking about an open-ended conflict. Does that make this an open-ended operation for the Sri Lanka Navy? Can we, after 6 months, say, we've had enough, we can't afford this, it's not ending?
For the sake of our economy at 250 million rupees every 6 weeks, I really hope it's a very short operation. I don't think we can afford anything like, I don't even think we can afford this, frankly speaking. But we've discussed this very well, I think, and I thank my colleagues because they brought a good perspective to it, because there are pros and cons. There's a cost benefit to be taken, right? So maybe, yes, it's good to show that we are part of the global trade, part of a team that guarantees global trade, that ensures there's no threats to commercial shipping. That's fine. But I think we've also made the point that this is a risky situation for us to be in, especially at this moment in time.
Right. So let's start off the final round with Rear Admiral Y.N. Jayaratna. What is your final take and what is the way forward for Sri Lanka now?
Well,
I'll give you
Shamir,
2 minutes.
you got only 2 minutes for
Yes,
it.
2 minutes
so
for you.
Sorry about it. I will find it harder to have comprise everything over there. See, as long as Gaza is there, and it is a division that the world has not seen anywhere in the past. The whole world is divided by opinion, by action, by decision. So is it something we can control? We don't have any control over it. So as a result of this, Houthis are taking place. So it is directly linked with Gaza. Can we do anything about it? We cannot. So in that case, why not we look at the opportunities that are being presented to us? So grab that opportunity. We are a small nation. Try to survive in these circumstances in which way or another by showing our commitment. So the bottom line is finances. Can we afford it? We cannot. So it has to be decided at the highest level of the government. So the government has made the decision. So they have to spend. So will they spend? Let us see.
Right. Thank you.
They spend our money.
Your guess is as good as mine.
Will they spend our money? Of course they would. Dinesh, you have any doubts about that, Dinesh?
No doubt whatsoever.
One good thing is that, see, out of all the OPVs we got, as I mentioned earlier, we got 2 brand new OPVs, but they are not operationally suited for that environment. They don't have the combat. Although it is made in India, it is a brand new. They don't have the combat management systems in place. So the vessels that are equipped with these are the 2 American gifted one and the Chinese one. So most likely these will take rotations. And when we do that, we will find that equipment we were asking for last few years to replace them, they will come naturally by way of donations.
Donations.
See, there's a possibility for that. So from the Navy's point of view, the things that you are asking this government since 2009 that didn't came all along in our national budget might end up in our.
Now the government has a rationale also, Rear Admiral. They can say they envisage the Red Sea conflict and that is why they increase the
Opportunity in
budget.
disguise.
Opportunity in disguise. It's all about how you play your card in the game.
Anyway, it's all our money, I must tell you that,
Absolutely.
without any hesitation. It's all our money that is being spent on someone else's war. So we now move our attention towards Kusum Bujethala, foreign policy analyst.
Thank you once again for having me, Shamir. So I'll close off by saying that the international system, the United Nations, international law, much of this has been concerned for the last 3-4 decades with preventing major conflicts between rivals, right? Specifically what? Nuclear war, mutually assured self-destruction. We're finding ourselves in a context in the world right now where there has been a Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that's also a proxy war with the United States basically funding the entire government of Ukraine, not just the Ukrainian military and the operation. Another major conflict that the entire world has been trying to avoid for several decades has been a conflict between the United States and Iran. With what's happening right now in the Gaza Strip, just yesterday the Fatah in the West Bank have started mobilizing their military as well because they've waited for as long as they can, I guess, with the onslaught in Gaza. When you take a look at what's happening in the Red Sea, and you take a look at the leverage that the United States has over this war and the war in Ukraine, I think it's incumbent upon me to not mince my words, and I think I started with a critique of the United States, and I have to end with the critique of the United States as well. The United States has the leverage, it has the power, and I think it's in everyone's interest, including their political interests and their national interests, to ensure that the war in Gaza closes as soon as it can and that the war in Ukraine closes as soon as it can. I know it's not completely up to them, but no one can deny the amount of leverage that the United States and Western powers have over both conflicts. I would urge the powers that be to use their leverage as much as they can, as soon as they can, to end these conflicts. If you're concerned about commercial shipping, inflation, the movement of goods across the Red Sea, you should be at least as concerned about the lives being lost in the Gaza Strip and across the world. And specifically in the Gaza Strip, where you have a very clear level of aggression that is disproportionate. We've talked about there's claims of genocide. The South African government has brought a case at the ICJ against Israel. There's been plenty of comments about collective punishment in the Gaza Strip. I think I would be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to call for a ceasefire, and I think the only way you achieve a ceasefire is if the United States brings to bear the full pressure of its national interests on the government of Israel. So with that, I thank you once again for having me.
Thank you very much, Kusum. Nirantan.
Yeah, so if I could just continue from the point that Kusum made, a major problem that complicates this is that I don't really think anybody really cares about the Palestinians on a state level, despite the lip service that they pay. The friendship between the Saudis and the Israelis is still continuing. They just make public statements decrying the Israelis, but on a bureaucratic level, the Israel-Saudi relationship is still going strong. Most of the Arab states in the region, when they are directly asked this question, they quite openly say, look, we are fed up with the Palestinians. We keep trying to help them, and they're backstabbers. That's all they do. So most Arab nations and most nations in general are more than happy to pay lip service to how much their heart bleeds for the Palestinians, but none of them are in a position where they seem to be even remotely interested in stopping it. So that's a problem that totally, in my opinion, complicates things. The other thing which I stated earlier was that unless you actually enter Yemen and decapitate the Houthi rebels, this particular Red Sea crisis is not going to stop. So is there actually any kind of political or even humanitarian will to do that? I highly doubt it. So in general, it's bad. As far as Sri Lankans are concerned and our position is concerned, I would just like to repeat what I said in the start, which is that I am conceptually in favor of taking opportunities for Sri Lanka to be plugged into a regional or global security framework. But given the lack of clarity, I mean, the government itself does not seem to be interested in giving us non-contradictory information in terms of how much would be spent, how long are we intending to stay there, if Washington changes its policy with an election year coming up, what will be our response? There are many issues of uncertainty here. So even though I would, under normal circumstances, be conceptually in favor of something like this, this does not seem to be the situation for us to take advantage of, plainly because of how unprepared we ourselves seem to be for this.
Thank you very much, Nandan. Dr. Dan?
Actually, I'm not here to talk politics, but to talk about the real situation. In a crisis situation like this, how we could protect our commercial interests, how we could protect our economic interests, especially when it comes to commercial maritime. As YN said, maritime is a different domain at all, basically, right? Now, when it comes to the maritime domain, the work of the International Maritime Organization with regard to crisis situation is very important. Like when we saw the situation when the Somalian pirates were very active. They made the Sri Lanka's Arabian Sea area high security zone. But now they have lifted. Because why? Because the Somalian pirates were not active for the last 5 years. So from this year, January, the area is free. And you don't need private maritime guards or officers to protect private maritime interests in this region. So there is success. So likewise, one day there will be a situation that there will be no, I really hope so, that there will be no Houthi rebels to attack commercial maritime interests. Now this is why the International Maritime Organization brought various international instruments like the SOLAS Convention to protect the ships and its life at sea, because this is very important. There are people who are working in ships. Their lives have to be secured. It's not only the cargo. It's not only the goods that are on board. There are people who are maneuvering the ships. And then came the SUA Convention, the safety of ships against unlawful activities or unlawful acts, right? Then under the SUA Convention, the international communities have gathered to protect the private maritime interests. So I see this as another effort to protect the commercial interests of ships. It's not really as a kind of a political or geopolitical issue. We have seen bringing in of ISPS code for the protection of ports during the wartime. YN will agree with me how Sri Lankan ports were secured against the terrorists who the LTTE. Right? Because we brought in we adopted the ISPS code, we ratified the ISPS code, we brought in Piracy Act, we brought in the SUA Convention Act in Sri Lanka.
Right.
We brought in all these things for that. So that's my take. I mean, we have to protect the maritime industry as a whole in order to survive our ports and other facilities that we are giving. Also at the meantime, we need to protect our export-import trade and to reduce the freight costs so that we will ultimately benefit in the economy. Thank you very much, Shamir and Niresh, for inviting me.
Thank you very much.
For this very important discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dan Malika, maritime law expert. Thank you very much, retired Rear Admiral YN Jairath, for joining us this evening on the show for the very first time. Kusum Vijay Tilaka, foreign policy analyst, Nilanthan Nirundan, defense and policy analyst, as well as Dr. Dan Malika, maritime law expert. Thank you very much, Niresh Letambi, consultant English news director at News First. I leave you tonight with a quote, as I always do. He who is prudent and lies in wait for an enemy who is not will be ultimately victorious. Take care and be back.